Hi, welcome to Criminal Justice Research Methods. My name is Steve Montreal. I'm going to be your instructor for this course, and I want to use this first little bit here to give an introduction to the course and just quickly go over some of the things we're going to be covering as we go through the book, as you're doing your work, and really as you're learning about the scientific method. And in a nutshell, that's what the course is all about. We're going to be looking to see how the scientific method can be applied to issues and problems in criminal justice. We're going to talk about things like theories, variables, measurement, operationalization, hypotheses, gathering data, making observations, and some of these terms and concepts may be new to you, or maybe you've heard the terms, but it's going to be new in the way we're going to be using them, and that can sometimes make this a difficult course. But I just want to encourage you to stick with it. Make sure you do the readings, listen to these lectures, listen to them more than once if you need to, because much of this course builds on what we've talked about previously, and by the time we're done with it, I'm pretty confident that you'll have a good grasp of what it means to really examine a problem using the scientific method. Even though the course focuses on social science, the course does have applicability for the broader realm of science as well. That is, the scientific method that we're going to be using for the social sciences is the same method that is used in the physical sciences and in other sciences as well. The scientific method really is a way to think. It is a way to try to improve our thinking, give us greater confidence in our conclusions, help us to understand what is real, what is going on in the world, cutting through our misperceptions, cutting through the mistakes that we make in observation, and trying to give us a nice, clear, reliable way to gain knowledge, to understand what's going on. And for our purposes, we're going to be using this method to try to get an understanding of what's going on in this discipline of criminal justice. My intent is not to cover all of the assigned readings in these lectures, but rather to try and clarify some of the more difficult concepts, use examples every now and then. But again, it's going to be hit and miss. I'm not going to cover the entire chapter. That part is up to you. It's your responsibility. Some of the other exercises that you'll be doing will require that you read and understand the entire chapter. But my main focus here again is to help explain some of the general terms and concepts that are presented in this course. You'll find out that some of these units are longer than others. It just is going to depend on the material. Some of these units, there are 15, 16, 17 PowerPoint slides. Others there may be only 6 or 7. Again, that's just going to be driven by the type of material that's in that unit and how much explaining I believe is necessary to help you understand that unit. So with that as a backdrop, I want to move on now, and we'll take a little bit, we'll look more in depth at the question, why are we doing this? Why are we studying research methods? And why is this a valuable thing to know for a criminal justice major? How do we know what we know? How is it we come to believe certain things about reality? How do we come to our beliefs? As I said, we're going to be looking at one way that we do that, a way that has proven very beneficial, very productive for society as a whole. But there are other ways as well, and I want to just spend a little bit of time reviewing some of those other ways and then using those to contrast with the way that is the focus of this course, the method of science. Over time, philosophers have developed at least this idea of two different realities. There's experiential reality and there's agreement reality. And experiential reality, as you can tell from the word, this is things that we have experience with. We know because they are part of our direct experience. They are within our experience. For instance, we've all experienced the sun coming up day after day after day. We know that's a reality because we have seen it. We've experienced it. We go to a ball game and we're there, so we know the score. We know who won. We don't have to look at the paper the next day. We don't have to take somebody else's word for it. We know it happened because we were there. Spilling a cup of hot coffee on myself, I know that that's hot. Again, I don't have to hear anybody else or listen to anybody else tell me what would happen if I spill a cup of hot coffee on myself. I actually have the experience with it. So that's one way that we come to our beliefs, is through our experience. Another way is through this agreement reality. We've been told that things are real. And in this sense, what we are doing is we're relying on the experience of others to supplement our sense of what is real, to supplement our sense of knowing, listening to the testimony of other people. Another way of knowing is through tradition. And really, in many ways, this is a form of secondhand knowledge. It takes advantage of the fact that knowledge is cumulative. We don't have to start from scratch. We can rely on what others have discovered either last year or last century or 1,000 years ago. And knowledge is cumulative, and because we have language and because of the invention of the printing press and books, this knowledge is very easily passed down. It is we can certainly go and discover it ourselves, read it. We don't have to start from scratch. We don't have to create all this new information. We can rely on what others have already done for us. However, as you can probably guess, that can be wrong sometimes. Tradition can be wrong. One example in this area is, for a long time people believed the earth was the center of the universe. And people just believed that. It had been handed down to them from people who thought about it before, from the philosophers who had examined this question before. Copernicus comes along and he says, no, that's not how it is. I think the earth revolves around the sun. And eventually his theory is proven to be the correct one, and now you get a new tradition develop. But I do just want to point out that tradition, just because we've been told something is true and we've accepted that truth for many, many years, doesn't necessarily make it so. Another way that we know things is through authority, and this is very similar to agreement reality, in that again, this is secondhand knowledge and we're relying on the expertise of others. Whereas agreement reality really kind of focuses on the experience of others, authority is relying on the expertise of others, looking to those who hold positions of authority, positions of power, whether that because of their learning, their position, but whichever, that they have a certain, they're assumed to have an authority and expertise, and that the things that they say should be given great weight. The last one I want to focus on here at this point is what's called empirical research, and again, that's going to be our main emphasis. An early example of empirical research in the criminal justice field was the Kansas City Preventive Patrol Experiment, and this was an experiment that tried to test the hypothesis that the greater the police presence in a given area, the lower the crime in that area would be. And it's, you could tell it's based on the theory. It's based on this idea that the more police that are there, that are visible, that people can see, the less likely it's going to be that somebody's going to commit a crime. The less likely that somebody's going to take the risk of being apprehended. So it had a good theory behind it. That was a hypothesis that was going to be tested. And this is, summarizing how they went about testing that hypothesis. They set up different police beats. They compared police beats that had 3 levels of preventive patrol. They had a control beat where there was 1 squad car patrolling the area. They had proactive beats where there were 2 or 3 cars patrolling the area. And reactive beats with no preventive patrol, no police presence really to speak of. So you can get a sense here of what you're hoping to find, or what they were hoping to find, that in the proactive beats with more police cars, you would see a reduction in the amount of crime. And in the reactive beats, where there was no preventive patrol, you may even see an increase in crime. After about a year of collecting data, the data was examined, and lo and behold, it's discovered that there is no difference. There was no difference in the crime rates. There was also no difference in levels of citizen satisfaction with police or the amount of fear of crime. So this kind of contradicted what they had thought, but it was a study based on observation, based on data, based on a scientific approach to trying to figure out what might happen if we made this change. This was an early example of empirical research, and it shows or portrays knowledge that is based on both experience and observation, but experience and observation that are supplemented with some pretty rigorous rules. And we'll talk about those rules next. It's a sad truth that we make mistakes, that we don't always see things the correct way, we don't always make the right interpretations of the data that our senses are providing us. So, yeah, we make mistakes. We don't perceive the world accurately all the time. But there are ways that we can guard against that. And particularly when we're talking about science and the method of science, there are ways that scientists try to use to minimize the making of mistakes. One thing I want to point out at this right now, however, is that remember who is doing the science. Remember who is applying these different tools and methods of science. Human beings subject to the same mistakes that we all are. We all have our biases. We all have our blind spots. One thing that science tries to do, and those who practice science try to do, is be aware of those blind spots, be aware of those biases, and try to minimize them wherever possible. So I just want to go over the five different ways that we can make mistakes, and then point out what science tries to do to minimize those mistakes. The first is inaccurate observation. I'm sure you've all experienced this. You're walking down the sidewalk and you believe you see your friend up there coming towards you. However, when the two of you meet, you realize, well, that's not your friend at all. You were mistaken. You inaccurately observed something that wasn't really there. What science tries to do to correct for this is it makes observation a very conscious activity. It spells out exactly what it is you're looking for. And by being so aware of the observational process, that helps to reduce error. Another mistake we make is overgeneralization. We make conclusions based on an insufficient amount of data. Okay, we overgeneralize. We see things and we leap to conclusions. Okay, that's been said about me. Maybe it's been said about you. The whole notion of leaping to a conclusion means that you're going too far. The data doesn't support that claim. So what science tries to do is science relies on a sufficiently large number of observations, and in making sure those observations are representative. We're not cherry picking. We're not only selecting a few cases that support our claim. We would really want to make sure we have a nice broad set of data, and we have a large enough number of observations to make sure that we do not overgeneralize. We don't leap to conclusions that are in fact wrong. Another mistake that we make is selective observation. We see what we want to see. Okay, human beings tend to filter out ideas or events that don't correspond with their underlying beliefs. Okay, we selectively observe things. Again, we see what we want to see. Science, again, commits to a certain number of observations. So, by committing to a certain number, by making sure that we have a large enough representative class, science guards against selective observation. At times, we are all guilty of illogical reasoning. The way we think isn't perfect. We make mistakes. We take shortcuts that we shouldn't take. And what scientists do is they try to use systems of logic consciously and explicitly. Again, just the very fact that you are aware of what you're doing can help to minimize some of these mistakes that we've already talked about. The last one, briefly, is ideology in politics. Okay? Again, we let our ideologies, our view of the world, whether that's our view of politics or our view of human nature, our view of faith, that colors our perceptions of things. That impacts how we view and interpret news stories that we hear, what people tell us. So, our biases are always with us. And again, scientists can't eliminate their biases any more than anybody else. But the very fact that we are aware of those biases, that we can try to be as unbiased as possible, helps to minimize making mistakes due to ideology and politics. So again, as human beings, we are all subject to making mistakes in these 5 areas. Scientists, as human beings, are subject to making those mistakes as well. But it is through a very cognitive process and being conscious of what it is that we're doing that we can minimize the likelihood of making those mistakes. Let's explore a little more deeply this notion of social science. Now again, this course really is an introduction to the social scientific research method, so let's define what that method entails. Social science inquiry generates knowledge through logic and observation. Social science can be said to equal theory plus data collection plus data analysis. Alright, so what does that mean? Well, the first part, generating knowledge through logic and observation, we've discussed a fair bit already. It tries to use a rigorous method of thinking with clear logical pathways and rigorous and determined and observational techniques that try to remove our biases and minimize the chance that we are seeing it incorrectly. So it generates knowledge through rigorous thinking and accurate observation. We also say that social science equals theory plus data collection plus data analysis. For now, we can say that we can define theory as a set of logically related propositions that seek to explain some phenomenon. Another way of saying that is it's an interrelated set of ideas that seek to explain some larger idea. Whether that phenomenon might be why people use drugs, what causes recidivism, what influences the attitudes of minorities toward police. If we were to take each one of those things I just mentioned and try to explain why, for instance, why minorities may be antagonistic toward police, there would be different propositions. There would be different ideas that we could mention that would link to that overall phenomenon. Whether it's because of personal instances of abuse at the hands of police, or friends or relatives that they know who have had bad experiences, or things that have happened in the community to others. There's different related propositions, different related ideas that interrelate, that are related to one another in a logical way, that have bearing on that overall phenomenon. Data collection refers to the observational component, and again, collecting the data, making the observations, and then finally data analysis is looking for the patterns in that data. So again, in a nutshell, or very broadly, social science can be defined as theory, a set of interrelated ideas that try to explain some larger phenomenon, plus collecting data, making determined observations, and then analyzing those observations, looking for the patterns that might be there that can give us answers. Continuing to talk about the nature of social science, we can say that social science is based on theory. It focuses on what is, not what should be. And that's a key distinction. It focuses on what is. Okay, it tries to explain reality, not what should be, not what we think reality should be. Science cannot settle debates on value, primarily because people can't agree on the criteria for determining the issues of value. We disagree on our values. We have different values, we have different ideas of what the good life should be, what the good society should be. Maybe we have different ideas of what justice means. And since we can't agree on these issues of value, we certainly cannot expect, nor do we want science to jump in and try to settle debates on value. So, it's based on theory, and what that means is it focuses on what is, not what should be. Social science looks for regularities. It tries to identify patterns of behavior in social life. Groups of individuals in similar situations coming to exhibit the same type of behavior, same types of actions, or similar actions. And I think it's important at this point to point out that these patterns of behavior, these regularities, are probabilistic patterns. It's not a definite that people in certain situations, all of them are going to produce the same actions. The idea of probability and probabilistic behavior says that people growing up in certain situations, many of them, most of them, the majority of them are going to exhibit certain characteristics. And again, we're going to see that as we go through this course, the importance of an understanding of probability, and how we're not trying to predict with 100% accuracy. We cannot predict with 100% accuracy. After all, we're dealing with people, with human beings who make choices. But we are able to uncover probabilistic patterns. So social science looks for regularities, looks for patterns of behavior that are based on probabilities. Social science also focuses on aggregates, groups. Again, studying social patterns rather than individual patterns, individual behavior. The theories that we construct try to explain aggregated patterns of behavior, aggregated regular patterns of behavior. Social science tries to seek insight into certain classes or types of individuals, whether they be recidivists, sex offenders, sentencing patterns of judges, police chiefs, new recruits, drug users. Again, focusing on the class or the group or the type of individual, and trying to gain some insight and explanation maybe into why different groups behave different ways. At the heart of social science is this notion of variables and attributes. And again, we'll spend more time talking about this in a subsequent unit. But variables are things such as gender, race, severity of a crime, length of sentence, years on the force. They're characteristics of whatever it is that we're studying. These variables have attributes. They have different values. For instance, if the variable is gender, the two attributes or the two different values that somebody could possibly have would be male or female. If you're talking about severity of crime, you could set up some kind of scale where the different attributes would range from least severe to most severe. And then you would need to determine how many steps you're going to have between those two poles, and what are the criteria that you're going to establish that will determine whether a given crime, or that will determine where a given crime lies on that continuous scale. Social science then uses these variables and looks for relationships. It examines the variables and their relationships between these variables. And what we hope to find is that a person's attributes on one variable cause or encourage a particular attribute on another variable. Okay, that's a sense of influence, where variable X is having an influence on variable Y. Education levels are assumed to have an influence on income levels. And the higher one's level of education, the higher one's income. And also, it works the other way as well. The lower one's educational level, the lower one's income. So we look for these relationships among our variables. And let me introduce at this point the notion of dependent and independent variables. The dependent variable really is the variable that you're trying to understand. It's the phenomenon or the behavior that you're trying to explain, trying to predict, trying to understand. The independent variables are those that are assumed to work on the dependent variable. So again, if income is our dependent variable, we want to understand why it is that somebody earns a certain amount of money. Education would be an independent variable. Perhaps their field of employment would be an independent variable. Perhaps their gender or their race might be independent variables. Things that it is hypothesized or things that it is expected to influence the dependent variable, to influence the amount of income. Or if we're talking about crime and we're looking at census tracts or neighborhoods, maybe we would say the amount of property crime is the dependent variable, and what might explain how much property crime goes on in a neighborhood. And we could list some ideas, and again, income, education, unemployment rate, value of housing. Those would all be independent variables that we're assuming or we are hypothesizing are going to have an impact on the dependent variable. Once we have our hypothesis and we have our variables, then of course we go about measuring those variables, collecting the data, and then analyzing that data, looking for patterns. The second purpose for doing criminal justice research is called exploration. Estimating the level of drug abuse in the United States would be an example of this type of study. Exploratory studies are carried out when you wish to learn more about a particular subject, or you want to get a sense of what might be happening in other locations. Determining the number of cities that have created special drug units would be another example, or perhaps graffiti units. Trying to learn to see how other jurisdictions have created their homicide departments. Again, these are ways of trying to explore a particular problem or issue, gain a little more insight into it, see what's going on in other places, helping you then make your decisions based on the information you gather. What's happening in other cities, in other states, in other countries that maybe you can borrow from, learn from, explore what is going on to inform the decisions that you might be making. Moving back to a focus on criminal justice research, there are four main areas or four purposes for conducting criminal justice research, including exploration, description, explanation, and application. In terms of description, this is where data is compiled and presented. But we're just describing the extent of a given problem or of a crime problem, or we are describing the policy responses to such problems. Data that's collected in the Uniform Crime Reports, the UCR data, for instance, is a good example of descriptive criminal justice research. Again, just trying to describe it. What's going on? What does it look like? How is a policy response shaping up? The third main type of criminal justice research is explanation. And this is, common sense. You want to understand why something might be happening. You're looking to explain an event or a phenomenon. Why do people believe the police are effective or ineffective? Why does Washington, D.C. have such a high murder rate? Why is a particular crime-fighting technique successful in this jurisdiction but perhaps not in your jurisdiction or in another jurisdiction? Studies of explanation are designed to explore studies in depth, but not only just trying to do some exploration, but also try to find the causal factors, the underlying factors that can explain the given phenomenon that you are studying. The last of the four purposes is application or applied research. This is where you want to go beyond simple description or exploration or even explanation of a particular problem. You're looking for knowledge, for understanding that can help you apply a given policy to head off a problem or to fix a problem. There's two main subcategories of this main purpose of application. The first is evaluation research, where you are comparing the stated goals with the outcomes. Again, is the policy working? You implement a particular crime fighting strategy. You want to know whether that's been successful or not. You have clearly defined goals. You know what success means. You gather data and you see whether or not your goals, the policies that you have changed or implemented, are meeting the outcomes. The second main type is policy analysis. This is more future oriented. This is where you kind of evaluate different policies before a policy is actually put into effect. You're looking to see what impact this attempt might have over that attempt. What might this action produce as compared to other actions? Both evaluation research and policy analysis are key tools in crime fighting and in understanding this whole discipline of criminal justice. And this is really more tied to governmental action, again, where you want to get a sense of whether or not the program that you initiated is working, it is producing the desired outcomes, or when you are evaluating different things to try, different policies to try, you conduct a policy analysis to get a sense of whether or not this might work, and this one may work better than that, why it might work, so that when it does become time to implement a policy, you have some data to suggest that it might be successful. Alright, so far we've gone over a little bit about what social science is, what it claims to do. We've looked at some of the terms. We've just briefly described 4 different purposes for doing criminal justice research. I want to spend a little time now talking about different approaches to social science research, and begin by talking about 2 different ways to explain things. We've said that science has as its aim, or as one of its aims, to help us understand phenomena, to explain phenomena. And at this point I want to point out 2 different ways that philosophers and researchers have come up with to explain things, and these are ideographic and nomothetic explanations. Now again, words you probably have not heard before, but they do have really straightforward meanings. An ideographic explanation is an explanation that tries to explain a single event completely. Try to understand all of the causes of what happened in a particular instance. I think a good example here is investigating a crime. You have a specific crime, whether it be a homicide, a rape, a robbery, whatever, and it is your job, or it is a detective's job, to try to understand why that occurred. All of the different actors, the environmental influences that went into that event, trying to explain a single event completely. Can be considered fairly narrow, doesn't have broad application at all, but again, it does its job very well. It gives you a very complete understanding and explanation for a single occurrence. The second one is nomothetic explanations, and this is different. This tries to explain a type or class of events rather than a single one. This seeks to come up with an explanation that can be applied in a whole variety of cases rather than just an individual case. Another way to think about this is a nomothetic explanation seeks to explain efficiently, and what that means in this case is not using a lot of different factors, trying to narrow down or perhaps identify the key influences for this particular event, again, thing that we're trying to explain. Another word for this, a large word that will come up again later, is parsimony, and a nomothetic explanation tries to provide an explanation for an event in a parsimonious manner. And that just means the same thing as explaining efficiently, whereas it's trying to explain something or explain a broad group of events and relying on as few explanations as possible. So again, if you're trying to explain property crime, you aren't going to try to analyze every single property crime within a given jurisdiction in a year period or even a 1 month period, but you'll try to identify some broad categories in terms of time, maybe location, opportunities that are available, in trying to explain those events. Nomothetic explanations also settle for partial rather than full explanation. Again, ideographic, you are looking for full explanation. You're trying to understand the single event in as much detail as you possibly can. Nomothetic does not try to do that. It settles for partial explanation. Okay? It doesn't seek to answer all of the questions related to a group of events, but it just tries to highlight some of the most important reasons for those events. Social science generally prefers nomothetic explanations, as you could probably figure out. Why? Because it has greater applicability. For the social scientists, we try to find solutions and answers and explanations that cover a variety of events, not just a single event. That gives more. It has more applicability. It gives a greater sense of explanation, and it can be used in a greater variety of locations and instances than perhaps a more narrow explanation would have. Another thing we want to introduce at this point is the difference between inductive and deductive reasoning. Perhaps you've had this before in a logic class or at some point in your past. Inductive reasoning is this idea of going from specific pieces of information, and from those pieces of information you try to identify patterns, and then from the patterns you can come up with theories. Sometimes it's described as going from the particular to the general. Okay, again, inductive reasoning relies on gathering data, trying to identify the patterns, and then from those patterns deriving hypotheses and theories, broad statements about how these concepts might be related. Deductive reasoning works the other way. It goes from the general to the specific. It starts with the theories, with broad statements about how we think concepts might be related. Based on those theories, we come up with hypotheses, how two specific concepts might be related to each other, and then you gather data and you would then test that hypothesis. Social science research relies on both of these. They're certainly not mutually exclusive. They can both be present in the same study. The classic science model generally starts with the theory from which we deduce hypotheses, but in the real world it often happens the other way as well, particularly in exploratory research when we're not sure of what the underlying causal factors might be or the underlying causal process might be, and we're gathering data, and it is from the patterns in the data that we induce, or we then develop our theories and hypotheses. The last approach I want to mention right now is the quantitative versus qualitative data. And quantitative data tends to be numeric. It can be counted. It has mathematical properties. Things like income, years of education, number of crimes, length of jail, sentences. Those all are quantitative variables. That's quantitative data because it's numeric. It lends itself to counting and to numbers. Whereas qualitative is more general. It tends to it's not numeric in any sense. Qualitative data often is derived from extensive interviews, from field work, ethnographies, where you spend a lot of time with individuals and you really try to understand what motivates them. Then you go back, you look at the interview tapes, and you look for key words, key ideas that way. As you could probably guess, quantitative approach lends itself to a nomothetic way of explanation, and a qualitative approach is more ideographic. It's more specific. Social scientists generally are using quantitative data. Again, I don't wish to minimize the value of qualitative data. It is very important, particularly again in some of the exploratory studies where we don't have a lot of good understanding of concepts to guide our theory development or our hypothesis development. But quantitative data, because it tends to be easier to collect, and we can apply statistics and mathematical modeling to the data, and also because it leads to nomothetic explanations, meaning we can incorporate greater numbers of events in our explanations. social scientists tend to prefer quantitative data. You've just heard me mention words like theory and hypotheses and concepts, measurement, and these are ideas and words that we're going to give greater explanation to in the next couple of units. But I do want to introduce them here briefly, talk about them briefly, so that when we do get to them in subsequent units, we've got some basis, some understanding of what they mean already. When we're talking about social science theory, theories, as we've said before, it's a way to try to explain different concepts, different ideas. What are some of the influential factors in determining crime, or specific crimes, or recidivism? And so a theory allows us to look at different traits, different characteristics of individuals, and try to see how those traits, how those characteristics might piece together to form some type of explanatory framework into what might lead to that behavior. Theories really are made up of concepts, variables, and hypotheses. And a concept, for now, let's say a concept is a mental image. It's an idea we have in our mind that represents some phenomena that we can't necessarily touch or see. We have this concept of justice, and we could all define justice, and our definitions may be similar, they might overlap, but they also could have significant differences between them. But justice is a concept, but again, you can't go out and touch it. You don't see it walking down the street. It's a mental creation that we have that we attach meaning to. And one of the things that makes social science so tricky at times is the idea of going from the concept to the actual variable, to the thing that we're going to measure. And again, we're going to spend more time talking about that shortly. Another key part in this whole process is the idea of variable. And variable is at the nuts and bolts level, the variable is what it is that we're going to be measuring. It's what we collect data on. But again, variables, it's different people have different characteristics, and whether it's race or income or intelligence, these are things that vary among individuals, and we look for relationships between variables. Hypotheses, I'm sure if I asked you what is a hypothesis, many of you would be able to say, well, that's an educated guess. And that's true. It is an educated guess. We have a certain amount of understanding that lies behind our guess or our statement of how we believe two things to be related. Okay, does poverty cause crime? Does unemployment cause poverty, which then causes crime? What's the nature of these relationships here? A hypothesis is a statement relating two concepts to each other, and then ultimately that is what we test. That is what social science tests to see whether that hypothesis is true. There's also this notion of operationalization, and I talked before of concepts being these abstract images. Well, somehow we have to make those abstract images concrete, and that's through the process of operationalization. We can define that as being the steps, procedures, or operations taken to identify and measure the variables we want to observe. Okay, and again, it's the steps, it's the procedures, it's the operations that we would take to actually identify and measure the variables that we want to observe. And again, variables come from our concepts. It's relatively easy to measure certain things, like the number of robberies. That can come right from the police reports, right from UCR data, whatever. It's fairly straightforward. But if we start talking about concepts such as social disorganization or fear of crime, that gets a little tougher. How would you measure fear of crime? Or how would you measure social disorganization? A neighborhood that has so many strikes against it, so to speak, that it's disorganized. It really is. It's hard for that neighborhood to function properly. It's hard for families to raise children in that neighborhood. It's hard for people to feel safe or businesses to locate in that neighborhood. And the sense of social disorganization maybe you've had criminology already, or maybe it's coming up. But there's a section in there that talks about the role that society has in causing crime, and it goes back to this notion of social disorganization. But again, how would you measure that? That certainly is not something that you can measure very easily. Now, there's creative ways to do it, and we'll talk about that in some units down the road. But for now, this idea of operationalization in many ways is at the heart of this whole process, because how successful you are at operationalizing your variables, at identifying and measuring the things that you're trying to observe, how well you do that will go a long way towards how accurate a reflection of reality your study is. And then just the last thing here in this point is this notion of measurement, and we've kind of talked about that a little bit. We're trying to measure our concepts, we measure our variables, and we need to come up with measures that are sensitive enough that will tell us when that particular characteristic is there. And, going back to the fear of crime example again, or racial prejudice, it would be another one that would be difficult to operationalize, difficult to measure. And we have to come up with instruments that would allow us to measure these variables. So when we talk about doing social science research or the creation of social science theory, we can break that down into notions of theory and what goes into different social science theories, the key component of operationalization, and then the actual measurement, which when done correctly then allows us to test our hypotheses, which can then either confirm or force us to maybe reject or redirect our theory. In the last slide I said that a hypothesis is something that you test. It's a statement relating two concepts together in some way that we then would gather data and test to see whether or not that hypothesis confirms or disconfirms or forces you to somehow modify your theory. Well, how do you generate these hypotheses? Where do you find them? And there's no hard and fast rule to this, but there are some things that you can do. And remember, the research design that you will be completing for this class will require that you generate at least one hypothesis, and perhaps more depending on the topic that you are studying. So how do you do this? How do you go about generating hypotheses? The first thing you have to do is identify a general area of interest. Okay, what part of this field, what part of this discipline really interests you? Are you interested in corrections? Are you interested in law enforcement? Are you interested in the behavior aspect of criminals or the behavior aspect of police officers? You're going to have to choose a general area that you want to explore a little bit more deeply, and something that's going to allow you to come up with a research design. Once you have chosen that general area, then you're going to do a literature review. And a literature review is, one way we can define that at this point is simply going through the journals, the periodicals, and seeing what other people have found out about police corruption, or recidivism among sex offenders, or bias in judicial sentencing. And there's many people have already done work in all of these areas, and I'm sure that whatever area you choose to study in depth here, other people will have done some work on that topic already. So you do a lit review, you look to see what other people have done, and it is through that literature review then, based on the theoretical understanding that the literature review conveys to you, you develop a hypothesis. Or that's kind of the long way of doing it, and it's a very effective way of doing it. But perhaps you just want to cut right to the chase, and you already have a sense of what it is you want to study, and you already know how you think your concepts are going to relate to each other, and that's fine. Or perhaps you're thinking of doing more of a policy analysis or a policy evaluation. Maybe you work for an organization that within the last year or two has implemented a new kind of procedure, a new kind of policy, and you want to see if it's had any effect. That's perfectly fine as well. You'll still need to do a literature review, but in this case you've got the hypothesis before you actually have to go out and do a literature review. So either way, you develop a hypothesis by looking at what other people have written about the subject and using that to spark your ideas, or you might already have an idea of what it is you want to study. After that, you're going to have to operationalize your hypothesis. And again, we're going to go into more detail about this in a couple of units, so I don't want to do that right now, but in a nutshell, when you operationalize your hypothesis, you're going to have to look for ways to measure your variables. Okay, again, it takes these abstract concepts that we talk about in our hypothesis, and we bring those down to earth. We try to make those as concrete as we can so we know exactly what we need to do when we're going to go out and measure our variables. And then the last thing we would do is test that hypothesis. Does the data support our hypothesis or not? Okay, why research methods? Why is this course in the major? Why are you taking this course? There's a number of reasons, and again, I think they'll become evident as we go through. I just want to make a quick comment about this text. I believe this is an excellent text, primarily because it uses criminal justice and criminal justice examples to teach research methods, to teach the discipline of social science research. I believe knowing how research is generated can help us in evaluating research. It can help us to make decisions about what a particular study might mean and whether or not we can trust its results. Having the ability to evaluate the work that is done by others is really central to a manager's position and manager's function. A manager is getting material all the time from other people, and in a way you have to rely on the methods that those other individuals used to produce the information. And even though you always want to be able to rely on that, it still does help to be able to understand some of the tools and techniques that were used to generate this information. So really, criminal justice professionals, whether they are in law enforcement or corrections or academics or they are policy professionals, are both consumers and producers of research. They generate and plan research studies, and they analyze the results of those studies. They desire to base decisions on information that is gathered correctly, information that is gathered with the minimum amount of bias. So again, having an understanding of the methodology will help criminal justice professionals in not only carrying out their own research, planning their own research, helping others do research, but it will also help them evaluate the research and information produced by others. Many criminal justice professionals review numerous reports and numerous studies that are produced by governmental agencies, by other private organizations. Just two examples, the National Institute of Justice and the Justice Department both produce many research studies that have to do with crime, with incarceration, with economic issues that relate to crime, with how certain policies that have been tried, how they are faring, whether they are working. And again, knowing a little bit about how these studies are produced can help make decisions about whether we want to implement those studies, or it can give us a greater sense of what those studies might mean for us in our jurisdictions, our work life, and again help us evaluate the nature of those studies. Finally, in many police departments now, they're using a problem-solving approach that in some ways can be considered a mini research project. It's made up of 4 steps: scan, analyze, response, and assessment. And the first step, scan, is just kind of looking at your environment. What's going on out there? What are some of the trends? What are some of the potential problem areas? And really, the problem-solving approach seeks to be proactive. So looking at your environment, looking at what you work in and the types of conditions that your jurisdiction might be in, and seeing where some of the potential dangers might be. Scanning your environment, getting a sense of what's out there. Then the second part is analyze. Okay, maybe you think you've identified a potential problem. There's some worrisome trends in the data. So you analyze the data and you get a sense of what does this really mean. Then third, you develop a response to it. You try something. You increase the police presence. You change the patrol tactics. You meet with community members more often. You do something. You initiate some kind of policy, some kind of an action in response to this problem or a potential problem. And then finally you assess. That you evaluate. Did it work? How successful were we in crafting a response to this problem? So again, scan, analyze, response, and assessment. In many ways, that's what we're going to be doing when we are doing a research project. We're looking at what's out there. We develop some kind of a question. We analyze that question in terms of what other people have learned about it. We then develop a hypothesis, and maybe that hypothesis is a policy. But then the assessment part really is the bulk of the course here, is where we're going to be identifying variables, we're going to be gathering data, and then we're going to be evaluating that data. So all those things I just mentioned, there are some of the reasons why I believe this is an important course and why I believe the material that's covered is an important knowledge base to have. I believe knowledge of the social scientific research method is necessary to be a successful manager in a criminal justice environment. Alright, a quick review of why science claims to offer a privileged way of knowing. Science offers an approach to both agreement reality and experiential reality. It gives us a set of tools, a method of thinking that is used to evaluate our experiences and the experiences of others. Again, it's rigorous. It gives us a method of thinking that it's a way that we evaluate what we're told and what we are experiencing. Assertions need logical and empirical support. It needs to be based on clear thinking and on the evidence. Science provides standards for accepting realities we don't personally experience. So, yeah, we can, trust what somebody else has said, even though we haven't experienced it personally. We can believe what somebody else has said, as long as we can evaluate their methods. Okay, we have standards, we have rules that we can follow that will help us determine whether we should accept the realities that somebody else is trying to convince us. Science offers a formal approach to the discovery of reality. Again, it's a formal approach. It's a method. There are guidelines. There are tools. There's a set of agreed upon practices. And there's two terms that we'll revisit every now and then in this course, and maybe you've come across already, that relate to this area. The first is epistemology, which really is the science of knowing, and we've been talking a little bit about that. How is it that we know what we know? How is it that we can trust what we believe we know? And then methodology, the science of finding out what are the tools, what are the techniques that we can use that will give us an accurate representation of reality. This course is going to focus primarily on the methodology, the set of tools that we're going to use in order to help us determine reality, determine how to pose and hopefully how to answer problems in the criminal justice field.